Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. We do appreciate it. It is Prescription Opioid and Heroin Epidemic Awareness Week, a long title that is again putting the spotlight on a problem that takes 130 lives a day. A staggering human toll that can't be ignored, and it certainly is not. It is a crisis that is leading to sweeping changes in how these drugs are used and prescribed. But there is another side to this that doesn't get talked about as often. What becomes of those who rely on those powerful drugs to get out of bed, to move, to live?
It's very depressing. You know, I never had problems with depression until I started with chronic pain, and now I'm on antidepressants. And, you know, I'm only 55 now. I've been dealing with this for 21 years, you know, and so, but I try to stay positive.
That right there is Debbie Gudinas. She suffers from a number of pain-wrenching ailments. We're going to hear more from her in just a moment. But her story highlights the complexity of dealing with this issue. We've all heard the stories of how the opioid epidemic has devastated families. Just last week, Debbie Dalton came to our studio. She lost her 23-year-old son, Hunter, to an overdose a couple years back.
We were so shocked, and what I say to parents is, it's not you until it is you.
Because that's the thing, you could have curled up in a ball, I guess, and just, or gone away.
That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and never want to talk about this again, but you took a different path. Why?
For Hunter.
Yeah.
He pushes me, and it really is so, it was so shocking. I can't say that enough. And, you know, I meet with parents, and I can see the sympathy, certainly empathy for our situation, but I also sometimes can just sense that, well, that's not ever going to happen to me.
That is a pain that will never go away, and there's no way of getting around the fact that opioid overdoses are now the leading cause of injury-related death in the United States. There's also the economic burden to this. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says prescription opioid misuse costs the country $78.5 billion a year. That is the cost of health care, lost productivity, addiction treatment, as well as money spent on courts and jails. This cost in lives and money has states and local governments looking to hold someone accountable. The target tonight is Purdue Pharma. The company introduced OxyContin in 1996. It was sold as a slow-release medication that would be less addictive and less likely to be abused than other opioids. Here's Dr. Heather Manos from Novant Health.
Doctors were sort of taught to prescribe opioid medications for pain in the emergency department, for chronic pain such as osteoarthritis, back pain, hip pain, and on an ongoing basis. And the idea was that these medications were not addictive. But what we found out over time, over decades, is that they do have great addictive potential, despite what was taught or thought in the 1980s and 1990s.
And in 2007, 3 Purdue Pharma executives pleaded guilty to deceptive marketing and paid $635 million in fines. But the company, keep in mind, made several billion dollars off the drug. Now, just last night, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. It's part of the company's proposed multi-billion-dollar settlement with several local governments that have sued. But there are some more questions here. New York's Attorney General says the family that owns Purdue Pharma, the Sacklers, has been moving around about $1 billion between different accounts. The discovery comes amid growing allegations that the Sackler family is moving the cash offshore to protect their wealth. A New York congressman wants the family thrown in jail.
Anything other than what I want the Sackler family charged as criminal drug dealers. Their homes confiscated, their cars confiscated, their wealth confiscated both at home and abroad. These shell companies disbanded and that wealth confiscated as well. They have spent the last decade preparing for this moment. They've spent the last decade hiding their money throughout a global system designed to protect billionaires, protect them against the law, protect them from paying consequences.
So while we wait to see what becomes of that settlement, we have the crisis of addiction and overdoses staring us right in the face. What do we do about it? Well, one thing being done is a complete revamping of how opioids are being used and prescribed. Doctors less likely to call for their use. And as for those already taking them, they are seeing their dosages being tapered or cut off altogether. But is that the best way to handle all of this? Tammy Marks, who works for North Carolina think tank RTI International, told the Washington Post, "We are in the midst of a national experiment as misguided as the one that had doctors putting millions of people on opioids to begin with." She says there hasn't been enough research done on how best to de-prescribe people. Now, RTI did do a study that was published earlier this summer in the Journal of Substance Abuse and Treatment. The research found more than 50% of patients who discontinued long-term, high-dose prescription opioid pain medicine did so suddenly. And among those, almost half, 49%, had an opioid-related hospitalization or emergency department visit. Dr. Mano says part of the problem here is the way this is being approached.
Instead of there being a patient-centered approach, policy is being based on all these folks overdosing. There are many alternatives, but I would argue not enough, and not enough research has gone into developing medications for chronic pain other than opioids.
And that leads us back to Debbie Gudinas. She emailed us after a segment we did a few weeks back about the state's efforts to curb the addiction and overdose epidemic. She suffers from back problems, fibromyalgia, and osteoarthritis. She says the opioids she has taken responsibly have allowed her to have some quality of life back. But lately, her pain has been increasing and her medications can no longer be adjusted. And like the millions of Americans living with chronic pain, she's worried.
You know, I feel like I won the worst lotto in the world, you know, because I have fibromyalgia. But fibromyalgia goes along with a lot of pain problems. You know, sometimes it's an injury or an illness, you know, and fibromyalgia is just chronic pain. You know, somebody can, you know, touch me on the arm and it's painful.
For those who haven't lived through chronic pain, how would you describe it?
You know, it's really hard. Because before I had chronic pain, you know, it was just like you had a backache, you took some Tylenol, you felt better, you know, and this is just pain never goes away.
So what's working for you?
Right now I take morphine and I have a spinal cord stimulator in, you know, and I take lots of muscle relaxers, and then I take a drug called gabapentin. It helps with a lot of like the burning sensations that you get in the eye types of pains. You know.
Are you getting less of that medication now because of the law changes?
Well, what happened was about 9 to 12 months ago, they had a policy where they weren't going to do any increases. You know,
So to manage the pain, you were needing just little bumps every now and again?
Yeah, I would go up and I would go down.
Okay.
That's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you have more pain, you know, when the weather's bad, when it's really cold, you know, different things like that. Like, you know, when the barometric pressure changes a lot, you know, things get a lot worse. And so, you know, you go up and down,
Okay.
you know, and depending on what you try to do.
How big of a difference has that made for you?
It's been significant because I depend on these drugs to live. You know, I've taken them for 21 years. I go to the pain clinic in Charlotte. I get drug tested periodically. You know, never had a problem. I've never taken anything that I shouldn't take. Yeah, it's been hard, you know, because my pain and my health care is being affected by somebody else's opioid addiction.
Obviously, we have a crisis in this country. We are
Absolutely.
losing a lot of people
It's terrible.
to this opioid crisis that we've been talking about. What do you want? You want to see some flexibility in this? How can we manage this to help people like yourself who aren't abusing, but yet protect so many people who can fall victim to it?
Well, I think there needs to be like exceptions for pain clinics, you know, because these doctors, like the doctors I see and the physician assistant I see, they are wonderful. They are absolutely wonderful, and they are amazing at what they do. And they know how to prescribe, and they're always careful about giving you too much. Even before all this happened, it's like, you know, Debbie, your dosages are pretty high, you know, and they work with you. And I just want them to understand that, you know, I understand people get addicted, and they're bad drugs, you know, for a lot of people. But for me, they're lifesavers.
Another perspective on all this, we always want to know what you think. Should there be more flexibility in how opioids are prescribed and used? Use the hashtag OYS Tonight on social media or email AskJamie@WBTV.com.